Welcome to St. Matthew's Digital Church. We are so glad that you chose to stop for a moment and tune in today. We would love to connect with you, so if you haven't downloaded our app yet, you can search for it in your favorite app store using the words St. Matthew Lutheran Church. It should look something like this when you find it. Now, inside the app, you can connect with us using our Hello card. You can also leave a prayer request under the prayer request button, and you can even choose to give digitally to support the ministry here at St. Matthew. Also, you can connect with our small groups, and some of those groups are digital groups that you can connect with. Now, our app is the hub for our digital ministry, and it's a great way for you to stay connected, so be sure and download it and get involved using our app. We're continuing our series in Daniel. This is the second to last week in that series. And throughout this entire study, what we're looking at is the life and faith of Daniel, how it relates to God, how it relates to being under the siege of an empire, and how do we have faith and walk with God in really difficult moments. And we see this in the life of Daniel from a teenager all the way into his senior adult status. So this morning we come to Daniel chapter 6. You'll know it well. It's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Darius reorganized his kingdom. He appointed 120 governors to administer all the parts of his realm. And over them were 3 vice regents, one of whom was Daniel. The governors reported to the vice regents, who made sure that everything was in order for the king. But Daniel, brimming with spirit and intelligence, so completely outcast the other vice regents and governors that the king decided to put him in charge of the entire kingdom. So the vice regents and governors got together to find some old scandal or skeleton in Daniel's life that could use against him, but they couldn't dig any up. He was totally exemplary and trustworthy. They could find no evidence of negligence or misconduct. So they finally gave up and said, we're never going to find anything against this Daniel unless we can scheme up something religious. The vice regents and the governors conspired together, and they went to the king and said, King Darius, live forever. We've convened your vice regents and governors and all of your leading officials and have agreed that the king should issue the following decree. For the next 30 days, no one is to pray to any god or mortal except you, O king. Anyone who disobeys will be thrown in the lion's den. Issue this decree, O king, and make it unconditional, as if it were written in stone like all of the laws of the Medes and the Persians. So King Darius signed the decree. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed and posted, he continued to pray just as he always had done. His house had windows in the upstairs that opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he knelt there in prayer, thinking and praising his God. Now the conspirators came and found him praying, asking God for help, and they went straight to the king and reminded him of the royal decree that he had signed. Did you not, they said, sign a decree forbidding anyone to pray to any god or man except you for the next 30 days? And anyone caught doing would be thrown in the lion's den? Absolutely, said the king, written in stone like all the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Then they said, Daniel, one of the Jewish exiles, ignores you, O king, and defies your decree. 3 times a day he prays. At this, the king was very upset and tried his best to get Daniel out of the fix he had put him in. He worked at it the whole day long. But then the conspirators were back. Remember, O king, it's the law of the Medes and the Persians that the king decree can never be changed. The king caved in and ordered Daniel brought and be thrown into the lion's den. But he said to Daniel, your God to whom you are so loyal is going to get you out of this. Now a stone slab was placed over the opening of the den, and the king sealed the cover with his signet ring and the signet rings of all of his nobles, fixing Daniel's fate. The king then went back to his palace. He refused supper. He couldn't sleep. He spent the night fasting. At daybreak, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den, and he approached the den. He called out anxiously, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve so loyally saved you from the lions? O king, live forever, said Daniel. My God sent his angel who closed the mouths of the lions so that they would not hurt me. I have been found innocent before my God and also before you, O king, and I've done nothing to harm you. When the king heard these words, he was happy, and he ordered Daniel taken up out of the den. And when he was hauled up, there was a scratch on him. He had trusted his God. Then the king commanded that the conspirators who had informed on Daniel be thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they hit the floor, the lions had them in their jaws, tearing them into pieces. King Darius published this proclamation to every race, color, and creed on earth. Peace to you, abundant peace. I decree that Daniel's God shall be worshiped and feared in all parts of my kingdom. He is the living God, world without end. His kingdom never fails. His rule continues eternally. He is the Savior and rescuer. He performs astonishing miracles in heaven and in earth. And he saved Daniel from the power of the lions. From then on, Daniel was treated well during the reign of Darius and also the following rules of Cyrus the Persian. Now, those of you who know me know how much I love baseball. That's an absolute lie, right? There is nothing I really love about baseball, except it's fun to go to the games live. But there is this extraordinary professional baseball pitcher who performed very few extraordinary feats. He was a veteran of 21 seasons. In only one season did he win more than 20 games. He never pitched a no-hitter, and only once in his career did he lead the league in any category. And that was in 1980 when he led the National League with a 2.21 earned run average. Yet, on June 21st, 1986, pitcher Don Sutton rubbed shoulders with the true legends of baseball pitchers when he became only the 30th pitcher in baseball history to win 300 games. Now, his own analysis of this success is worth noting. He said, I'm a grinder and I'm a mechanic. I never considered myself flamboyant or exceptional, but all of my life I've found a way to get the job done. Through 2 decades, 6 presidential terms, 4 trades to other teams, he consistently did what pitchers are paid to do: win. With tunnel vision, he spent 21 years redefining greatness. Yet most people, even people who love baseball, don't even know his name. In September of 1986, Inside Sports magazine called him the family sedan of baseball men on the mound. He certainly boasted none of the Ferrari style of the last 30-game winner, Denny McLain, who rose to stardom but faded quickly. He boasted none of the Mercedes sparkle of Sandy Koufax. But after their type were parked in museums or junk piles, Don Sutton was still on the mound getting the job done. Now, there are many Ferraris and Mercedes and Porsches in the Bible. People like Paul and David and Moses and other people who speed across the pages of the scriptures, accomplishing great things for the glory of God. But Daniel's like the trusty family sedan. Now, to remind you where we are in this text, the first time we meet Daniel is when he's a young teenage boy who's been taken captive from Babylon. Even then, he's faithfully serving the Lord and taking his stand for that which is right. We meet him again a few years later in chapter 2, when a young man, he's called up to interpret a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. And again, we see Daniel simply serving the Lord and being faithful. He shows up again in chapter 4 as a middle-aged man who is again called to interpret a dream for this troubled king. And once again, Daniel's found simply rolling along, being faithful. There he is again in chapter 5, standing for God and being faithful. And then in chapter 6, the text before us today, Daniel rolls into view, and here he is, a man in his 80s. He's been in Babylon for about 70 years, yet he's not veered from the course he started out as a young man. He's still faithfully serving the God who saved him by grace. He has this long obedience in the same direction. Now, Daniel, he didn't make huge splashes in Babylon. Though he was continually being promoted through the ranks of the government, finally arriving at the position of virtually what is the prime minister. And the Jews were still in captivity in Babylon. So as the prime minister, he's a slave prime minister. The new king, the king in this chapter, Darius, who's probably also known as Cyrus, allows the Jews to return to Israel to rebuild their temple. Yet most of the exiles chose to stay in Babylon, because they'd adopted the customs and the lifestyle and created families in Babylon. This is what happens in repatriation. So the Babylonian reculturation worked. After all these years of being influenced by God's people, Babylon is unchanged. You get that? The rulers have changed, but they're still cruel and violent and brilliant and wicked. There have been no great revivals in Babylon while Daniel was there. It seems that a few people are really impressed with Daniel and his walk with God. And it seems that all his faithfulness to God did was sometimes even draw the jealousy of his peers and the hatred of the ungodly, and even a plot against his own life, a death sentence in a den of lions. But through it all, Daniel rolls on. He remained faithful in spite of the challenges around him. And Daniel practices this long faithfulness in the same direction. In this passage, Daniel is cast into a lion's den. He's sentenced to die for doing nothing more than being faithful to God. And while Daniel's facing a terrible sentence, he holds fast to what made him a great man. Daniel kept the faith. So notice the details about Daniel's life that teach us about this great man of faith. Daniel was a man of character. Now, Daniel's position we see in verses 1 through 3. Darius had appointed these 120 princes to rule over the kingdom, and these men helped ensure Darius and his kingdom were protected from theft and tax evasion and military revolts. Apparently, these men ruled over specific provinces within the kingdom. And over these 120 men were 3 other men. These were vice regents, and one of them was Daniel. Now, what's so amazing here is the fact that Daniel is a slave. He was brought to Babylon as a young man, enslaved, taken from his home and his people, trained in the ways of the Babylonian court and religion and philosophy, and he's been faithful to God. And God has blessed Daniel's faithfulness, causing Daniel to find favor even with every single one of the pagan kings that he served. And after 70 years of faithful service, this slave becomes, in essence, the prime minister. See, God honors faithful service. Now, God may never promote you or I to prime minister, especially since we don't have one in America. But in the eyes of the world, we may not be promoted. But it's important to remember that God sees everything we do and it matters. Now, in verses 4-9, we see that there's this problem. And the problem is that those around Daniel are jealous of him and they want to destroy him because he's a Hebrew and a slave, and they're Babylonians and Persians. And they shouldn't have to bow to the likes of Daniel. So they concoct a scheme to get the king to make a law that no one could pray to any god, because they knew there was no other way to get Daniel because he was so faithful. They couldn't catch him on any failure or fall that he had. All they could do was create a scheme that if Daniel prayed, somehow then he would get in trouble. And that the scheme was for 30 days, nobody could pray to anybody but the king. So Darius, the king, decides he's going to sign it, and he strokes his own ego and his pride. And Daniel's problem was that he was faithful to the Lord. And the leaders around him hated him for his faithfulness. They despised him because he was different. He was set apart. He was honest. He was real. Daniel has everything they couldn't be, and they couldn't stand him because of it. Right? Sometimes in our lives, in the world in which we live, we can be hated for doing the right thing. And it's hard. And sometimes people will try to trap us and create trouble because they don't like what it looks like to be faithful. Now in verse 4 and 5, we also see Daniel's deep sense of purity and faithfulness. The Bible tells us that Daniel was promoted because he had an excellent spirit. The word excellent means preeminent. Daniel has a spirit in him that set him apart from everyone else around him. Beyond that, when the other presidents of the kingdoms wanted to find some deficiency in Daniel that they could attack, they couldn't find it. Daniel was faithful and faultless. That was his testimony among this crazy world of Babylon, where it's a society where everything goes. Daniel kept doing the right thing. See, wouldn't it be a blessing if that were true for our government leaders now? Consider, for instance, the 100th Congress that met in Washington, D.C. from January 3rd, 1987 to January 3rd, 1989. I went back in history so nobody could say that I was being political on one side or the other. Here's just a small sampling of the reality of that governing body. 29 had been arrested for spousal abuse. 7 convicted of fraud, 19 arrested for handwriting bad checks, 117 bankrupted 2 or more businesses, 14 arrested on drug charges, 8 arrested for shoplifting charges, 21 with lawsuits against them, and 84 charged with driving while intoxicated. I mean, come on. When they couldn't find sin or secrets in the life of Daniel, they could exploit the fact that he was faithful to God. So all of this led to Daniel having to make some choices, right? A long obedience in the same direction requires that we make consistent choices over and over. So Daniel's faced with a choice. Should he remain faithful to the Lord, or should he bow to the vanity of a king? So watching Daniel face this crisis in his life, you get this impression that he was not at crisis at all. Daniel simply did what he had always done. He prayed. He went to the room, or he went every day, 3 times a day. He opened his window like he had for 70 years. He turns towards Jerusalem and he prays to the Lord. That's how Daniel makes this long obedience. He chose obedience to God over opportunities in the world. Daniel didn't open his window to draw attention to himself as he prayed. This window was already open. All Daniel did was bow down before the Lord and pray. It was the Lord's will for Daniel to be faithful, and that's what he did. He bowed toward Jerusalem because God promised to hear the prayers of the exiles who faced toward his house when they prayed. This comes from 1 Kings chapter 8. He didn't close his windows to hide what he was doing because Daniel wasn't ashamed of his faith. Daniel wasn't ashamed of God. He chose faithfulness to God over even the favor of a king. For Daniel, the decree of Darius changed nothing. He simply went before the Lord and prayed and gave thanks 3 times a day as he had done before. He remained faithful in spite of the will of a human king. Daniel chose devotion to God over that decree. Now, the decree was only for 30 days. He could have chosen to just close the door and pray in secret, or he could have chosen to not pray for that amount of time. For many, they could have simply not prayed for 30 days, but not Daniel. His faith in the Lord would not allow him to be anything less than what the Lord wanted him to be, even if it was for 30 days. Now, Daniel chose to bow before God before he chose to bow before these enemies who were setting up schemes. The desire of Daniel's enemies was to bring him down. And I imagine they would have left him alone if Daniel would have adopted the ways of the religion of Babylon. But Daniel refused to bow to their will. Instead, he chose to remain faithful. He chose a faithful testimony over fleeting treasures. For Daniel, prayer was far more important than popularity. He would rather be found faithful than enjoy the power and popularity and wealth that he could have had if he would have compromised. And this is another choice, right? Daniel chose commitment over compromise. Consider for a moment the excuses Daniel could have made for not praying. He's 80 years old. He could have said, I'm tired. He could have said, I'm the prime minister of Babylon. I'm a little too busy to be praying. Yet Daniel doesn't make these excuses. He remains faithful because he knew it was right. So then Daniel chooses to be faithful even above his own freedom. Daniel was willing to give it all up, his possession, his wealth, his power, and even his life. Daniel chose love for God over his own life. He was willing to sacrifice his life because he loved the Lord more than he loved himself. And Daniel chose character over comfort. See, Daniel was willing to face the lions and death, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice the character that he had so faithfully walked for the last 80 years. See, Daniel was determined to stand for what was right simply because it was right. He was determined to stand for the Lord regardless of the consequences. He was determined to remain faithful, whatever the cost. And for Daniel, this cost was very high. Now, I love that we have examples of Daniels in our church today. I love that God would allow me the courage to live a life of faithfulness for 80 years like Daniel. How beautiful that God would give us all the grace as women and men and folks who would settle for nothing less than the absolute faithfulness to the movement of God in our lives. The fact is, we give up far too easy. See, the moral of Daniel's story is this: God honors faithfulness. Why? Because God is faithful. And when we're faithful, we're actually being like God. Because Daniel remained faithful to God even to the point of death. God was with him and delivered him from his enemies, from the decrees of the king, from the power of lions. Daniel succeeded because Daniel was faithful to the Lord. Because he was faithful, God gave him victory. Now, the truth is, even had the lions devoured Daniel, Daniel still did the right thing. It didn't matter the outcome, right? So faithfulness, and part of what faithfulness means when we follow in the way of Jesus is faithfulness means that regardless of the outcome, we do that which is right. This is the story of Jesus on the cross. Now, we may never face a den of lions. We may never face a burning fiery furnace like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but we might face some of the trials of other saints of God that have been called to endure. We might face times of sickness and sorrow and distress and persecution and death and hardship. Through it all, God makes us some promises. He promises that will never leave us alone, not even for a moment. We read this in Hebrews chapter 13 and Matthew 28. He promises that his grace is sufficient for every step we take, That's in 2 Corinthians. And he promises us that he'll guide every step we take in Psalm 37. He promised to meet every need we have in life in Philippians 4 and in Matthew 6. He promised to hear us and to help us when we call on his name. That's Jeremiah 33 and Philippians 4. There's so much more that he has promised to do for us. And just because he loves us, just because we're his children, and he asks us to be faithful. There's one sentence every child of God wants to hear said in the end. Well done, my good and faithful servant. There are some things we can't do, but there are things that we can. We can be found faithful. We can be faithful to the Lord who has freed us from sin. We can be faithful to the task to which God has called us. We can be faithful to pray and to study and to read the word. We can be faithful to witness. We can be faithful to attend to God's house and his kingdom. And we can be faithful to love him and our neighbor and ourselves. And we can be faithful to the things that matter in our lives, like our families, our friends, our work, our community. I can't be some things, but I can be faithful. And God doesn't call me to be a Ferrari or a Porsche or a Mercedes. He didn't call me to be a Formula One race car. He called me to be a faithful family sedan. And so may we be faithful like Daniel.
Gratitude to you for your goodness, for your kindness pierces time through. Let those who struggle speak this, for your kindness pierces time through. In my despair I called on you, and you answered me like the sky. You are for me. I cannot fear. For what can a man do to me? You are for me. Embrace me. You are my strength and my song, my rescue. The voice of rejoicing and comfort rings through the tents of the upright, and your right hand upholds it, exalts it. Your right hand upholds. I will not die. I will live to speak of what you do. You have laid me low for my errors, but never given me up. Open for me the gates of uprightness. I will enter them and give thanks. This is the gate that belongs to you, the gate the upright enter. I give thanks to you, for you have answered me. Become my rescue. The stone that the builders rejected is now become the cornerstone because of you, and it is miraculous to our eyes. This is the day you have made. In it we will be glad and rejoice. And we pray, send us happiness. Blessed is the one who comes in your name, whom we bless out of your house. You are our sovereign, our light. Bind the festival offering with cord. Bring it to the horns of the altar. For you are my sovereign, and I give thanks to you. You I exalt and praise. Accept my gratitude throughout your goodness, for your kindness pierces time through.
At St. Matthew, we practice what we call rhythms. Rhythms are just a way for us to connect and fall deeper in love with God, with our neighbor, and with ourselves. So this week, I would like us to take on a little bit of something that historically has been called the Ignatian method, looking at our lives and examining who we are, also called the Examen. Eugene Peterson has a great book I encourage you to read at some point called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. Now, obedience is about choices we make. Daniel chose. He chose obedience to God over opportunities in the world. He chose faithfulness to God over favor of the king. He chose devotion to God over the decree of the king. He chose bowing before God instead of bowing before his enemies. He chose a faithful testimony over fleeting treasures. He chose commitment over compromise. He chose faithfulness over freedom, love over life, and character over comfort. So this week, I challenge you to look at your choices. What direction have your choices taken you in life? Do you like that? If not, set some steps and goals in place to change the direction of your long obedience. And if you love it, set goals to make sure that you hold course. Good luck.
Thank you for joining us today. St. Matthew is a neighborhood church making a world of difference through people like you living out the message of hope, grace, and love each day. We invite you to connect with us digitally by downloading our new church app on the App Store or Google Play. Through the app, you can connect with the vision and mission of St. Matthew, find groups to connect with, be prayed for, and even give. We invite you to join our community of faith and to help us make a difference in the world.